Right, welcome to the Sheep Farm podcast. I'm going to do a brief introduction for a change because I've got two guests on tonight. This is episode 268, and we've got one returning guest and one new guest, which is going to be very interesting, the subjects that we're talking about. It's very close to my heart. I know Chris enjoys the subjects as well. In fact, it freaked us out about 5 or 6 years ago when we heard Jerry first tell his story. So we've got Jerry Marzinsky, who's been on the podcast 7 times over the last few years. Jerry's a retired psychotherapist. For over 35 years, he's been a psychotherapist, or he's got 35 years worth of experience working and studying the thought processes of the psychotic and criminally insane patients in some of the, I won't say worst, but most volatile psychiatric institutions in the US. But I thought America was just an open psychiatric unit.
It's getting there.
The old ICE psychiatric unit, yeah. He began his career at Central State Hospital, at the time the largest psychiatric hospital on the planet. And he is it still the largest, Jerry?
No, it's out of business now. They closed it down. It's the most haunted hospital in the United States, I believe now.
Everyone's been cured, have they?
No, the Ghostbusters are still in there trying to cure them.
Right. He is now a leading light in the field of where these thoughts evolve from. And together with his friend and co-author Sherry Sweeney, they wrote a groundbreaking book, an amazing journey into the psychotic mind, breaking the spell of the ivory tower. And joining us is someone me and Chris have listened to over the last 5 or 6 years, especially initially on Jason and Crow, going back into the dark days of 2020, when everyone was locked down, forced to wear a mask, we had to stand 6 foot apart, etc., and believing all the nonsense that we were being told. Funnily enough, it were happening in every country at the same time. During the nonsense of 2020, he was one of the only, there was a few of them, medical professionals, a shining light, who was speaking out about the tyranny. And he calls himself a recovering physician. Have you recovered yet, Andrew?
It's a process, you know. maybe at the end of this show, you can give your opinion if I've recovered or not.
Maybe you need to seek help. Maybe, sadly.
Believe me, I have. It's bankrupting me.
But he's now, as you can sense, he's moved away from his mainstream medical career to challenge the conventional paradigms. But that comes with its usual conflicts for anybody who dare actually speak the truth against the pharmaceutical industry. Maybe you should ring President Trump up. He's on your side now. Oh, no, he came up with Operation Warp Speed, didn't he? Yeah. He's ideally placed to discuss tonight's topics as well, as he had a psychiatric residency at Duke University. Now he dedicates himself to researching and delivering trustworthy products that can help people's lives or change lives. So tonight, we're going to be talking to Jerry Marzinsky and Dr. Andy Kauffman. Welcome, guys.
Thank you for having us.
It's not a problem. I don't really know. I mean, we spoke to Jerry a few times, haven't we, Chris?
Just to say, Jerry, I lent my wife's friend your book, and I really didn't think she was going to read it. And she brought it back and said, "Oh, fantastic!"
Oh, good.
I said to my wife, "Do you think she actually read it?" And she said, "Yeah, she reads all sorts of things."
I was really
surprised. Yeah.
I get a lot of people writing in and going, "Thank you." I know it's not my broken mind. I know my mind isn't broken. There's another influence that's influencing me. Yeah. Now they can turn against that thing instead of thinking that it's their own mind rebelling against them. And there's, we're getting recoveries. We're getting full recoveries.
We got a lot of positive feedback whenever we spoke to you, of saying that really helped me, because I thought I was going, literally crazy. It's really helpful to people, isn't it, if you're getting pharmaceutical mafia, as you say.
Yeah, they're trying to tell you that your mind is broken and that the only thing that you can do about it is take their toxic drugs. And right now I think we got probably a 15 to 20% cure rate with Mace alone, and we got a small group of Mace researchers, that are pushing the boundaries of that. But what Mace does do, it gets rid of the trauma that the person has experienced, which the voices feed off of. They continually trigger that trauma. And then that negative emotion that it generates, that's their food. So they're basically what, the system calls the archons.
I would say that part where they feed like the Monsters Inc. paradigm, where they terrify kids to drain their energy out of them. It's a similar sort of process to that cartoon, really, isn't it?
That's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. And you can talk to these guys and ask them, how much energy did you have before the voices attacked and how much did you have afterward? And it's consistently they have less afterward. And you ask them, well, where did it go? You didn't use it. You were laying in bed all night tossing and turning. And where did it go? And they go, I don't know. They have no idea that the voices took it. And the voices get pissed off if you tell them that they're the ones that are taking their energy. Because like if you had a leech on you, you wouldn't just sit there and let it suck you. You do something against it. And it's the same thing with schizophrenics. Once they realize these voices are not who they are, then they turn on them and they have an enemy that they can fight against. And I had several prisoners who would ask the voices, who are you? What are you? And they would say, we are you. They
That's
want
nice
them to believe that those thoughts are theirs.
Where do you sit on this, Andy? Sorry.
Well, I mean, it occurs to me that, definitely, I definitely support Jerry's work, and I've field tested Jerry's work myself. But I thought it might be helpful to sort of give a background, like what schizophrenia is and what the mainstream in psychiatry says about it. So I was a psychiatrist before I kind of went rogue and into recovery, and more specifically, I was a forensic psychiatrist, which means I worked in similar settings to Jerry in forensic mental hospitals, jails, and prisons, and I also testified in court cases, including like a murder trial, insanity defense, competency to stand trial, all those issues. And one of the things we were taught is how to recognize the patterns of people with schizophrenia to tell if it's a genuine case or if someone is trying to fake being mentally ill to get out of, a criminal matter or to, get a disability payment and such. And that's called malingering, by the way. And so the patterns that Jerry alluded to earlier, so let me just start off with the basics. So about 1% of the population is diagnosable with schizophrenia or has this kind of experience that I'm going to talk about. And it's pretty consistent from country to country. Although what's different is that countries deal very differently with people with this issue, especially the developing versus the developed world. But in the United States, and very similarly in most of Western Europe, they look at this as basically a physical illness of the brain, and that the only way to treat it is with somatic therapies like drugs or even shock therapy, ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. In the past, they even did things like brain surgery, right? Like we might have heard of a frontal lobotomy, for example, or if anyone saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? They did both shock therapy and a lobotomy in that film, and drugs. The drugs are essentially tranquilizers, right? They're even called major tranquilizers. And so they turn you into kind of a zombie. They have lots of toxic effects that we could get into, and I think that may be one of the reasons Jerry wanted me to join this. But the typical experience of someone with schizophrenia, and we might more loosely call this term psychosis, is two things. One is delusions and the other is hallucinations. Now, I'm giving the mainstream perspective, okay? So I'll describe what those are because they may not be hallucinations, as Jerry pointed out, and even the definition of what that is not always entirely clear. But the delusion is defined as a fixed false belief, and it's false compared to our collective observation of reality, so it would markedly contrast with that. So for example, like if I believed that I was, a spy from God sent to fight agents of the devils to prevent the end of the world, right? And I kept that exact belief every day, that would be kind of a typical example of a delusion. And it depends largely on the context of the person's life experience, the nature of their delusion. So if they grew up in a very religious area, they tend to have more religious delusions. If they grow up in a more secular, atheist area, they might have more delusions related to the government or technology, for example. Now, the hallucinations is the most prominent feature for most people, and it's the perception of hearing voices when there's no one physically present that anyone else can see or hear. And they describe hearing these voices as if it's a sound, so not like in your imagination that you like have a conversation with yourself. That's not considered, a psychotic experience. But the content of the voices and the nature of the voices, like that they seem to be like a real individual, like people can say if it's a male or a female voice, if it's a child or an adult or an elderly person, if it has an accent, all kinds of things like this. And the content of what they say tends to be in a couple of categories, but the most common pattern in psychiatry, they refer to this as running negative commentary. And it's basically always being criticized, judged, insulted, called names, being put down. So you could imagine it would be like a torturous experience to have that running commentary going, and it would affect your ability to be productive, to have social relationships, right? And a lot of people with this condition, unfortunately, end up carrying out suicide. But
Randy, that's one of the first patterns I saw too, is that they were consistently negative. Yet psychiatry insists that these things are auditory hallucinations. Now, as far as I saw on the front lines, actual medical hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they're everywhere in between. These things, although they're called hallucinations, are consistently negative. The first question I had is what holds them on such a negative, consistently negative trajectory? How come they aren't random like regular hallucinations and all over the place?
Jerry, that's an interesting point, because let's just say, let's define hallucinations as that there's a direct physical insult of some kind to the brain that makes it, not function properly, and it creates sensory experiences that aren't real. So like we all know that drugs can cause this, like hallucinogens are called hallucinogens because they induce hallucinations, right? Also, many medical drugs like steroids, for example, in high doses can cause hallucinations, and several others. Then there's also like a acute illness that can result in hallucinations, like a fever. Like, you ever heard of a fever dream, right? Where you get visions during a fever. I've seen many examples of that in the hospital. And interesting, Jerry, when someone was sick, and usually this is a life-threatening illness, so not just a fever, at least what I saw in the hospital, they were always negative, but they were scary, not like negative being criticized, but like seeing spiders crawling on the wall that were huge, or things like that, or ghosts, like more of that flavor of stuff. But it was, I've only seen maybe a dozen cases, but it was always something scary and negative like that. But these were purely visual. They were not sounds. And, hearing the sounds or voices in those circumstances of, taking drugs and such is very, very unusual. Whereas in schizophrenia, it's the rule, right? It's the most common experience. They sometimes do have also visions, but they're much less common. And so what I think Jerry's getting at is that, we don't know for sure that it's caused by a physical insult of the brain, because there's no experimental model. Like, they never made a lesion in rat brains to make them hear voices. Not that you could do that, right? So it's just like an assumption by the medical industry that helps them medicalize it. Like, say it's a physical problem, that, and we're doctors, we do physical things. We do surgery, we do drugs, right? And so it keeps it in that model. There's no thought of, hey, let's step back. What could this be? Could this be some kind of psychic or spiritual experience? Does it have to be physical? No one's asking that question, because across allopathic medicine, they're only looking in the physical, in the material realm for the explanation of everything.
And they're making $11 billion a year selling drugs to treat this
they're
thing.
Extremely, and most of these drugs are actually, the most revenue comes from off-label use, but that's another story. But they definitely cannot cure. So all they can do, the best that they can offer, is with chronic lifelong use of these drugs, it can suppress to some degree the voices from either being heard or from bothering you. So in other words, if you're so sedated and tranquilized, you may not give a crap about the voices as much, or it may tone them down a little bit. But in my experience, this is not a meaningful effect. Most people don't want to keep taking the drugs because the benefit is little, if any, and it also makes them feel like crap because it basically suppresses your pleasure center. It causes all these physical movement problems that create discomfort. It makes you gain weight. It, shortens your lifespan, all these things. So the patients pretty much, they go to the hospital, they get put on these things. They won't be allowed to leave the hospital unless they take the drugs. They go home, they take them for a couple of weeks to appease their family. Then they stop taking them because they're so miserable. And then the whole cycle repeats. And that's pretty much the life for most of these folks.
Now, Andy, I've heard they were doing some autopsies with state patients, long-term psychiatric patients, and they found that their brains were shrunk due to these long-term psychiatric drugs.
Yes.
So they were actually doing neurological damage.
There's definitely, well, I mean, even beyond that, because, but yes, there is, atrophy of the brain, meaning that the actual brain tissue is smaller as a result of these drugs. But you already know that they're neurologically toxic because you have conditions like tardive dyskinesia, which is a permanent, irreversible movement disorder, right? That occurs when you take these drugs for a period of time. Your risk goes up over time. And then boom, even if you stop taking the drugs completely, you still have that brain poisoning. It's kind of similar to Parkinsonism, which these drugs also cause essentially the same exact symptoms of Parkinson's disease.
So with long-term use, these drugs are actually doing neurological damage. Nobody's getting better because of them. Is that true?
Yeah, but it's even worse than that because the metabolic toxicity causes them to die in their 40s and 50s. Even there was one study in Tennessee which looked at all of the children and adolescents who were Medicaid recipients, so they're all poor, and they're being prescribed antipsychotic drugs, not because they have schizophrenia and voices, but because of bad behavior. And a substantial number of these kids just had sudden death. They just dropped dead from these drugs. So, and you can still find that published study available to see the data. And I've even seen one teenage girl have sudden death from antipsychotics.
I mean, this is nothing new. We've just experienced the last 4 years of sudden deaths, and they keep continuing.
Yeah, well, when I saw that happen with all the athletes, I said, this is not unprecedented, right? Because it just wasn't on the news with the kids because they weren't professional athletes. And the professional athletes are probably not prescribed these drugs, but they were prescribed injections.
Yeah, definitely prescribed injections. I mean, is this just a continuation of sort of like the whole poisoning of the human race? Because, I mean, that's been going on for generations now, hasn't it?
Well, Dom, I think this goes back further because, we can go back to the time of the Marquis de Sade or earlier, and where people with mental illness were marginalized by societies. Like even in the United States in the early history, there were no mental hospitals, so they were put in debtors' prisons and almshouses. And it wasn't until I think the mid-19th century when Dorothea Dix, who was like a beneficent socialite, took pity and kind of created this movement to provide care of this population rather than punishment. And that's evolved since then. But in the early 20th century, in institutions, they were essentially torturing these people, doing things like insulin shock therapy, where they would inject them with insulin, where their blood sugar went so low they went in a coma and almost died, and then they brought them back. Or hydrotherapy, where they took fire hoses with freezing cold water and squirted them with it to try and purge the illness out of them.
Insulin shock.
Yeah, and when they did shock therapy, initially, they paralyze the patient before they do shock therapy. But before that, because the shock causes a seizure, so their whole body would be violently convulsing. They get injuries. All these people would be trying to hold them down. That's also a type of torture. And what happens, by the way, with shock therapy, and this is probably why it can sometimes appear to work, is it just causes amnesia. You forget about everything that's going on in your life, and it's kind of like rebooting a computer.
A friend of mine's father, he'll probably be listening to this. He went through the old electric shock therapy, and he died 4 or 5 years ago. If I'm not wrong, I think he was around less than 60-year-old. He was inside they give him it several times, and then just released him. And he were basically, he wasn't cabbage, but he was eating like canned custard. That's all he used to eat.
I watched one at Central State Hospital, and I got a strong stomach. I almost fainted when I went to walk out of there. I mean, and they were given 3,000 of these a year. And each one, neurologists can find brain damage due to each one.
I tell you what's surprising. In my research, I do a lot of research into like political figures and things like that. Look at the genealogy and the bloodlines. And when you go back through their generations, it's a lot like, I'll use the Huxley family as a prime example. A lot of the Huxleys were sent to asylums and given strange treatments. I know Julian Huxley was. And Boris Johnson's mother was put in the Maudsley Hospital that was run by someone who was part of the British arm of MK Ultra, and she was basically fried. She died of Parkinson's just a few years ago. So a lot of these high-powered political figures have gone through the mincer, if you like, as well. It's very intriguing.
It's possible they're doing something different with them, but this does remind me about the MK Ultra program, because this was a declassified program from the CIA in the United States, where they were basically experimenting with mind control programming, and they developed a research network in psychiatric hospitals, both in the United States and Canada. So like McGill University Hospital, their psychiatric hospital was one of the facilities. There was one in Colorado, several around the United States. And they basically, someone who was suffering with some kind of depression or schizophrenia would go to the hospital, think that they were getting treatment, even though there were some barbaric treatments, as we discussed. But instead of that, they were given massive doses of LSD, abused, mistreated in a variety of ways without being told what's going on at all. And just because they were being experimented on, and there have been many successful lawsuits for some of those victims, but that gives you an idea, just like the psychiatric drugs we were talking about, antipsychotics, some of those were used for torture and interrogation purposes by the Soviet Union. So we can look around the world and see that the institution of psychiatry it's not about helping people who are mentally ill, generally speaking. And it may have taken different roles over time, but essentially it's about controlling these folks, that they are seen as subversive in some way, and they need to be, marginalized and kept out of the way and kept under control. And the tools that we think of with a superficial knowledge as therapeutic are really tools of that control mission.
Do you think there's a bigger picture? Sorry, Jerry, go on. I'll let you.
I got some stats here from 2017. They're old, but it talks about psychotropic drug statistics for children in the United States. Now, this is there's a lot worse now, but this is for 2017. They said more than 7.2 million kids were on psychiatric drugs. Over 622,000 of these kids are under the age of 5. There were over 80,000 on ADHD drugs, which is amphetamine, which is what I saw in the prison. Amphetamine caused more schizophrenics than any drug I've ever seen. all these prisoners were saying, yeah, I went psychotic on meth. I thought it would go away. It did for a long time, and then it didn't one day, and it was with them now. So over 80,000, they're giving Ritalin and Adderall, which are forms of amphetamine. Over 38,000 were on antidepressants. Over 85,000 were on antipsychotics, and this is kids. These are the drugs that cause brain damage. Over 389,000 were on anti-anxiety drugs, which are usually addictive. Right? So these guys are going after the kids. I mean, this is ridiculous.
I know a young lad, Jerry, I work with, and he got diagnosed with ADHD. I think he's 18 or 19 now, and he kept going to the doctor and saying, "I need to get off these things," and they just kept giving him different drugs to try and his parents wanted him to take them. I mean, bless him, he got to an age, I don't know what the age was, if he was 16 or 18, where he could decide for himself, and he said, "I'm stopping taking them," and he stopped taking them. But he said to me, which was quite horrible, he said, "I just wonder." He's a really nice lad, by the way, but he said, "I just wonder who would be if I'd never have had those drugs."
Or I talked to a number of prisoners who started off on Adderall and Ritalin, and they liked it. It calmed them down. It increased their awareness. They were a bit sharper. They could get more stuff done, and then they just kept increasing it. And then they went from Ritalin to meth on the streets. And what happened was they keep upping the dosage, and it would make them feel like Supermen. They'd be able to get things done, and they'd stay up for days, and it felt good, like and then they started hearing voices. Okay, and the voices, when they came down, a lot of times the voices would disappear. And that might have happened 25, 30, 50 times, and then on the 51st time, they did not disappear. And they were just as schizophrenic as any of the people in the state hospital.
I did a bit of a brief once on how many Hollywood stars, if you like, actors and actresses, were actually, so if I looked at the news and the amount of Hollywood actors and actresses that are diagnosed with a mental condition is off the charts. I actually stopped doing it because it was getting quite boring to how many, people who just are mainstream actors. And so they're actually selling it through Hollywood to make it normal, if you like Botox and all the other stuff that they're doing. And these drugs now are they're handing them out like confetti. And sorry, that was meant to be a question to you, Andrew. Do you think that they're using Hollywood and places like that to sell these things to the average people, if you like, to make
right? Well, I can't necessarily speak to an individual situation, but that's been going on a long time. In fact, one of my team pulled a story about Elvis promoting some vaccine back in the day. Might have been a polio vaccine.
Yeah.
Right? So, it's clearly that they use celebrities. I mean, we know they put them in public service announcements. Obviously, there were a lot of them promoting the jab during COVID. So this is routine. I mean, when we were kids, if you recall, it used to be against the FCC regulations to advertise pharmaceuticals on TV. Now you can't put a TV program on without a pharmaceutical ad, right? And even during the Super Bowl, etc. So they are using marketing and advertising, tactics all the time to encourage people. And we have this cultural aspect of that no one wants to do the hard work to fix problems. They want a quick solution, and that's what the white-coated priests, have a monopoly on. They have the quick solution. Here, take this pill. You'll feel on top of the world, temporarily, and nothing will be different in your life except now you have poison in your body, and you have to come back to get more. So they're a robot.
They turn into a semi-zombie. And what I'd like to bring up also, Andrew, is the DSM. I mean, when I was in the doctoral program, that was the Bible. They've made you study that thing and memorize all these categories and the subcategories, and it does look impressive. But the bottom line is they don't have a single objective test to test
Can you
any
just
one.
explain what the DSM is, Jerry?
The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
And
Psychiatry's Bible. It's a list of all the mental disorders known to man.
is that the list in that? Was it a late 60s meeting they had where they put together compiled this massive list? Is my thinking right there?
They started before that. They started in 1952 when they had a list of 106 psychiatric disorders. In 1980, that jumped up to 256.
Is that all?
Now the DSM-5, they have 297. So they are making these things up as they go along. Like I said, there's not a single objective test for any of them. None of them. Zero. There's no EEG. There's no lab test. There's no EEG. There's nothing. They make these things up and then they vote on them.
Maybe they can invent a PCR test. Then we're all saved.
You should see some of the ones they have on there now. They got mathematics disorder. If you don't like math, like I don't, I'm guilty of this one. Mathematics disorder. You do bad in math, you're disordered. Caffeine intoxication disorder. You drink too much coffee, you're disordered.
What about older brother intoxication disorder?
Yeah.
Chris might suffer from that.
Yeah, can I get repellent?
Well, they do have sibling relational disorder. So if
There you go,
I've
Chris.
got that. Yeah, I've got it.
they're fighting too much, you got that. Then
it's essentially written that no matter who you are, you'll qualify for more than one thing in there.
And they got a drug for it.
So when didn't they have at one point? I remember watching something years ago, and where they devised. I think it was one of those videos that I think you've got it on your YouTube channel, Jerry, where they had a meeting. It was like the World Psychiatric Meeting. I'm making that name up. I'm recalling it from memory now. And that's when they first devised these. Right, so that one psychiatric problem, you need this one particular drug for it. And that's where they sort of devised the full plan to take over the world.
No, it's not quite like that. For the DSM that Jerry's talking about, there is a large committee. And, the way they came up with this is basically they got a bunch of psychiatrists and perhaps some other mental health professionals together, and they just described their patients in general terms, and they said, oh, okay, well, we'll just come up with these categories. And, some of them are kind of obvious, like, depression, right, where there's a lot of sadness, like we know what that is. Anxiety, where people are super nervous and panicky, we know what that is. And then when people have schizophrenia and they're out of touch with reality, we know what that is because we can't really, relate to them. But outside of that, right, they tried to come up with a lot of other categories, and it gives the impression that these are real things. And I'll tell you that even the three categories that I described, a lot of times they're combined. Like you see people who are psychotic and they're really, really anxious, or people who are so sad that they start to hear voices or have delusions. So they're really, it's most likely what it is that there are different causes, and then any individual can express their response to those causes differently. Like even what Jerry was describing, that, people who take psychostimulants like amphetamines often experience psychosis, but some of them don't, right? Some of them have other issues related to that besides psychosis because there's just individual differences, but they just came up with an agreement. They're like, okay, we agree it's this many categories. And then when they came together several years later to reformulate it, of course, they added a bunch more categories, and they add more each time because there is the pattern that the more they add, then the more people get diagnosed with mental illness, then the more people come under their care or buy their drugs.
More drugs,
because,
that's right.
Yeah, because these people all have conflicts of interest. So these psychiatrists that come together for this meeting, many of them are academics, which means that they, have relationships with the drug companies. They get offered grants or to participate in their studies or to get paid consulting fees and such. So that's incentive, to do this thing. And, it's probably, if you get invited to be part of this, it's probably considered a major honor. So you can't really separate. It's just like with the training, like for doctors to maintain your specialty and your license, you have to do ongoing training. They call it continuing medical education. And the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, they're the ones who board certify psychiatrists. They have, to get your board recertification, you have to study certain materials that they approved. But if you go and look into the materials they approved, the drug companies or the pharma industry, they get together and create these shell companies, which are medical education companies. And they basically are developing educational materials that promote their products. And then since they have power and influence, they cut deals with the board specialties, the certifying boards, to require those. So you go in there, you have to do this required thing, you have to take an exam every few years, and all those questions are essentially written by the pharmaceutical industry to make sure that you know to prescribe their drug, and that's the only way to deal with it.
And 2/3 of that board were said to be associated with the psychiatric or the pharmaceutical industry. That board that makes up these diagnoses, 2/3 of them. And they also use the DSM for billing. They got that number system.
Well, they tie it to all the diagnoses in there are matched up or used to create ICD codes, which is the International Classification of Disease. That's an international coding system. I think they're on the 10th version of that. And so if you open up the DSM, there'll be an ICD-10 code next to every diagnosis, and that's what allows you to bill for it. That's what allows you to prescribe, because the insurance company is only going to pay when those codes are provided.
I mean, obviously, it works slightly different in the UK. Everything goes through I suppose I'll call it the NHS, but it's the MHRA and things like that as well, because it's a government subsidized. So the government are physically buying the drugs, aren't they? Which, in a way, it's even worse that because no one actually knows how much they're paying for them. But anyway,
well, hopefully they're paying less than the insurance companies are.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. But I know there's a big thing at the moment. I know during 2020, the budget went up about 50 or 60 billion from 2019 to 2020 alone. They chucked in 50 billion, just like they can just chuck 50 billion in to write more prescriptions, even though the hospitals were closed. Maybe it were to fund the TikTok accounts for the nurses so they could dance.
We do have something similar in the United States, Dom, that you remind me of, because we have Medicaid, which is the government health insurance for people who are poor. Okay.
Right. Yep.
And they decided that they're going to have a formulary for psychiatric drugs in New York State. So the New York State branch of Medicaid, and this was like one of the last years that I was still practicing psychiatry, and it was heavily influenced by the drug industry. So the government's paying, the drugs are for poor people, and they essentially put the most expensive, newest drugs on that formulary, the ones with the least experience and data on. And I'll give you an example. Like back when I was practicing, I remember there were some new antipsychotics that their average wholesale price was around $400 per month. And then you had the older generic drugs that average wholesale price was about $2 and change a month. So that's how the government can, corrupt when they just, are willing to spend whatever in order to satisfy whoever's going to give them the biggest campaign contribution.
I suppose the guys in government or in pharma are all playing game theory, so it doesn't really matter to them whether in there they can tell us they're helping us, but in reality they're just them poor people on Medicaid are just lab rats, aren't they?
It can be like that. It can.
Yeah, it's shocking. Going back to the voices, I suppose it's a question we get asked every time you're on, Jerry. Where does Jerry think those voices actually come from? I mean, it's the unanswerable question, probably, isn't it?
Well, that's one thing psychiatry and psychology never ask. Where do thoughts come from? They never ask that question. They can't measure them. They can't see them. They can't hold them. They can't test them, so that they just ignore them. They come from outside the person. So as far as I can see, the brain or the mind is like a radio receiver. It's tuned to a certain frequency. And these entities want it tuned to a low frequency. They're energetic parasites, and they feed off of that low emotional energy that they create. So if you look deeply into what these things are telling these people, which I got into trouble with psychiatrists when they caught me asking those questions at the Central State Hospital, they threatened me and said, "You keep this up, there would be repercussions." They told me these are hallucinations, and if you're asking questions about them, you're reinforcing the hallucination and making these people worse. At the time they told me that, I knew that was a bunch of crap. But you can't talk back to these people if they're over you.
Well, we've got one here. We can talk back to him now. He might shout at us,
we can talk. That's what I like about this one. You can talk to this one, But if you look at what these voices are actually telling these people, it's no good. You're no good. You're rotten. You're ugly. You're stupid. Nobody cares for you. Your mother hates you. They're just faking like you. Your wife is cheating on you. Your husband's cheating on you. It's all this negative stuff.
But if we think about it, Jerry,
negative.
When we were
Again,
kids,
it sounds like Dom talking to me.
When we were kids, I'm not saying everything were perfect. I'm not looking through rose-tinted glasses, but things were a lot easier to do things. I remember being kids, and when we were school holidays, we'd all get on our bikes and ride. Now parents don't send kids out anymore. Everything, especially since 2020, has become more compressed, more traumatized, and so they've even traumatized the whole generation of children now from 2020 who didn't go to school, who didn't understand that, who are right there at that age now where they will go to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist because they're suffering from some kind of depression. I think we talked about it was university graduates. Was it 70% of them, Chris, or some ridiculous figure are all off work with mental illness or something?
You've got to be very cautious of that kind of information because, like we were talking about, there are way more drugs now. There are way more diagnoses, and most people are getting treated by primary care doctors who have no experience or training with identifying mental illness. So it could just be a selection bias, like that.
That doesn't mean to say that, Andrew. I'm not saying they were all mentally ill. What it means is that these people are going in there, and the pharmaceutical industry or the government, as it is over here, are willing to give them a diagnosis of mental illness.
Oh, you don't like. There's no thought to it whatsoever. Because I was doing forensic psychiatry, I got to review thousands and thousands of pages of medical records. Okay, with people with mental illness, and a lot of them were from primary care doctors, and I've never seen really any one note be more detailed than this. This is what it says in the note: patient reports depression, no suicidal thoughts, diagnosis depression, treatment antidepressant. Like there's nothing else in there whatsoever. Not like married, employed. Sleep.
Recently fired.
Nothing. That's it. So there's no thought to it. There's just, many primary care doctors spend as little as 6 minutes per patient so they could see 10 patients an hour, right? Because that's the profit margins are so thin, they have to churn through those appointments in order to cover their overhead and pay for their salary. So, it's really, there's no rigor whatsoever. Now, are people generally under a lot of stress in our modern culture? Absolutely. Did we see upticks in suicide during the COVID years? Yes, absolutely, because we put more stress, on people. But is there a real trend of a rise in mental illness? I would say most likely not. But here's one thing that's interesting, because we were talking about trauma, and we're talking in psychiatry, it's true, they never ask why. right? They don't really ask the cause because they just assume it's probably genetic and that, there's some lab rat doing research and they'll figure it out. They'll let me know later. But they do know that childhood trauma is strongly correlated with developing schizophrenia. Schizophrenia generally has its onset for men in their late teenage, early 20s, a little bit later for women. There are always exceptions, but it really doesn't occur in childhood. But the childhood trauma, and I'm talking about even if you fell off your bike and broke your arm, that counts as trauma that increases your risk for schizophrenia. So it's not like anything new. And they even did studies with identical twins raised apart, or identical twins where one had a traumatic experience, the other didn't. And they still saw that the trauma predicted the schizophrenia later on. So that is a real thing. Now, we don't know if that's causal or if that's a covariable, and we don't know the mechanism, but it certainly makes sense with Jerry's formulation, because what he's really talking about is that there may be, right, an external entity causing these symptoms, but there is a vulnerability that an individual has. In fact, that may even be how the amphetamines bring about this problem, is that they exploit or create or magnify a vulnerability of that individual, which lets the outside entity come in and have influence and take hold of the person.
Imagine saying that to conventional medical people.
I remember between two episodes we did with you, Jerry, I remember you talking about amphetamines and crack cocaine, and people were more susceptible to the voices, etc. And in between those two shows, by coincidence, I was watching some on auras, and it was saying when people do crack cocaine or amphetamines, it can leave a hole in their aura. I thought that was interesting, how maybe the entities of wherever they are can maybe come through this natural
like the
defense.
key to the door type of thing.
Well, like a natural defense mechanism, some spiritual defense mechanism. Maybe
I think that's what happens with meth. I mean,
meth, that was it. Crystal meth, that was it. Sorry.
It just breaks open something and allows these things in. I don't know how it works, but boy, there's a 1-to-1 correlation between heavy meth users and voices taking them over or breaking in there.
Well, this thing I saw said it makes a crack in the aura. Yeah. So
and it's hard to tell if it's a chicken or egg phenomenon too, because it could be that the person is starting to break down and be influenced, and they're seeking escape, so they turn to drugs. And we know meth has it's popular in certain geographical areas, right? Like out in the western United States, and it's practically non-existent in the Northeast where I live. But there's cocaine and heroin here. Right, and it has a very similar effect on people. Like I've seen tons of people with heroin also become more and more psychotic, and it is hard to tell. Like, were they already on that path and then sought out heroin to escape, or was the heroin? But certainly the heroin did not make it any better.
Well, I'll tell you this: I talked to a couple of prisoners who ran out of meth. And the voices told them where to be and when to be there. And they went there and the meth was there. Somebody showed up with meth. That's more than one. It's like they know things that the patient
these addicts, they always know where to get the drugs. They always know. That's interesting. You think that information comes from the entities?
Well, these guys told me it did. There's one guy where the voices told him there was a marijuana field up in Oregon. He lived in San Diego. Now, this is after he recovered. No voices. He worked with him for 6 months. He was free of them. The voices told him, hey, get yourself 2 burlap sacks and a machete. I'm going to show you where there's a pot field up in Oregon. So he got all his money, took the sacks, drove up to Oregon, step by step, went where the voices told him, went down like a 23-mile dirt road, hit a dead end. He asked the voices, okay, what do I do now? The road's out. They said, there's a hiking path to your left. Go up there, walk a few hours, and you'll see it. So he did that. He went up, and here's this giant sesame pot field. So he went there, he cut down all the marijuana, put it in the sacks, and then he goes, okay, well, what do I do with it now? They told him, there's a federal park right near here. You can sell it there. So he went there. There was a federal park. He sold it, made a lot of money. And now this is weird. He said he bought all the prostitutes he could handle. He bought all the alcohol he could handle. He bought all the he was using cocaine. Bought all the cocaine he could handle. And the voices wanted to go fishing. And when he told me that, I'm like, "Okay, come on, man, you're pulling my leg." He goes, "No, honest to God, they wanted to go fishing." He said he went out to the Columbia River. He said he was the only one catching anything that day. The voices would tell him where to put the hook, what to bait it with, where to move on. Okay? So he kept doing that for about 2 weeks. And then he goes, "Okay, I ran out of money. I got to go up there and cut some more marijuana." And the voices told him, "Nope, they're waiting for you. Go up there, they're going to kill you. Take whatever money you got and go back to San Diego." And he was sane when he told me that.
What's your opinion of that story, Andrew?
Well, I mean, I'm not inclined to doubt it. Of course, I can't confirm it, but, one could do an experiment where they confirm this, type of information. But lots of people have had, throughout history, even people without schizophrenia have been inspired with information that turned out to be a true prediction or whatever. So I can't explain that. But here's my experience is that I was still practicing mainstream psychiatry when I first heard about Jerry's work, and we had several conversations at that time, and I had a teenage boy with a very severe psychosis. In fact, he was so psychotic that he couldn't speak at all. The only communication would be him shaking his head yes or no, and I think about 1 out of 3 things that I asked him, I'd get that response. And he was like this for months and months. I gave him trials of 3 different antipsychotic drugs because I felt that I had to do that or I'd be fired. But he didn't respond at all to any of those medications. And at that time, Jerry was talking about Psalm 23, like it was before he knew about Mace Energy Method, and had some success with this. And it was a shot in the dark for me at the time, but I called up his mother. I, asked if they went to church, if they were religious, if she was comfortable with, that kind of thing, and she was. And he comes in for an appointment, and I hand him a printout of the psalm, and I said, "Look, I think this will make you feel a lot better. And if you just say this, all day long to yourself." And I said, "Will you do that?" And he shook his head yes, and his counselor was really supportive. I think his counselor was just desperate to try anything because it was really hard to work with this kid. He comes back a week later, and he's talking to me. And it was amazing. Like I was surprised myself, but it was like a total turnaround. And then I switched him over to Sherry's program. I forget what it's called now. It's a live program. And, then that's when I got into trouble there for speaking out as a whistleblower. So I don't know what happened after that, but I know, it was incredible recovery. It was based on Jerry's theory. And that kid, everyone thought he was mentally retarded, and it turns out he was not, which we had to do this to find out because he couldn't talk to us and tell us otherwise.
He was basically possessed. Or it seems that way.
I think that's a valid opinion to draw from it.
How did you feel at that particular? I'm sounding like a psychiatrist now. How did you feel at that point? Because you were mainstream, and obviously that's
well. No, I was very, very skeptical at that time, and I was on the way, out of the mainstream.
Yeah.
But I was just extremely grateful to see this kid because I had felt sympathy for this kid. Right. It wasn't a good situation for him. Everybody around him was always just trying to manage him. And, he couldn't express himself. He couldn't thrive. Like he couldn't have fun or have any kind of, what we would consider normal. And, maybe he was in a fantasy world that was all cakes and rainbows, but I kind of doubt it. So to me, it was like just amazing to see, okay, now he can like be a kid again, at least for a moment. And, hopefully he'll continue to recover.
So that's one of the patterns. They do not like anything to do with religion, Jesus, or God. The voices just absolutely hate that. So when I was working in the prison, I had a group of schizophrenics that I was working with, and the agreement we had is when we're working together, I want you to tell me in real time what those voices are telling you. And so I had a group of prisoners who were willing to do that. I couldn't do that at the state hospital because I'd be in the same trouble we got into before, So they would do that. So what I was doing was experimenting. I found these patterns, okay? And I was experimenting with things that would disrupt those patterns. Now, after a while, one after another, they came into the office and they said, the voices don't want us coming here. They don't like you. They don't like what you're telling us. They don't want to do this stuff. And they were screaming all the way here. And this was all of them, like 13 of them over time. All of them said the same thing. So I figured, okay, if I'm doing something they don't like, that's good. That's good.
Let's do some push-ups.
Let's do some push-ups. But I wouldn't have done that in the state hospital because had one of them gone off, I would have been fired. But the prison was set to work with violent people. So it was like, okay, I can push them as far as I dared. And I had a good idea about how far I could push them. And then one day, one of them came to my office, knocked on the door, and said, the voices want to talk to you. And I'm like, I didn't even send him a pass. I don't know how he got into the medical unit. And I said, oh, yeah? Well, okay, come on in. Had him sat down. That had never happened before. The voices communicated with me through the patient. They would tell the patient, well, tell him this. And I'd tell the patient, well, go tell them to stick their head in the toilet or, whatever. I mean, it was all through the patient. They'd never talked to me directly. So I went, well, that's odd. And we sat down and closed the door. And I said, okay, well, what do they got to say? And these words came out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. Boom. That's when I knew that I was dealing with entities.
I think I'd have got my coat and gone home at that point.
Oh, it shocked me. It absolutely shocked me. And I looked at the prisoner and he said, I didn't say that. That was them. That wasn't my words. They didn't come from me.
Did the actual person who was purveying the message, did his voice change or his mannerisms or anything? Did like his facial expressions?
Not at that time, but there are times where they do. There is a slight change.
Yeah.
And there's a when they really get angry, their eyes change. They get black.
You can observe someone interacting with these entities. In fact, they even have a name for that in psychiatry. It's called responding to internal stimuli. And I've seen it many times because sometimes the person is so affected that they can't really talk to you. So you have to just observe and figure out, oh, that's what's going on. They're interacting with voices. And I'm sure Jerry's experienced that many times.
Yeah. And it was, trying to figure out what they were saying. And like you said, it was always negative stuff. So here's psychiatry insisting that these things are hallucinations. But and that's what I thought when I got on the front lines too. I mean, they just referred to them as auditory hallucinations. They didn't say a lot about what they were or how they operated, nothing like that. So I thought they were like word salad. Just like garbage. I like the hallucinations that are all over the place. That's not what I saw. They were carrying on long, coherent conversations with these voices. They were arguing with them. They were fighting with them. They were debating with them. It was like they were talking to somebody on a telephone where you could hear what they're saying, but you couldn't hear what was coming back to them. And that surprised me because, I've auditory hallucinations for years and years, auditory hallucinations in the colleges. They weren't responding to hallucinations. These were coherent,
A friend of mine's mother-in-law was going through she had psychotic experiences, and she used to put tin foil on her head. Right? She did actually do that. And I said to him, he weren't sort of like listening and to like the stuff that you talk about, Jerry. But I said to him, if he can, ask her why she puts tinfoil on her head. Just please ask her, right? Because although it's a mainstream term now, tinfoil, that wear, and all that type of thing, and she actually said to him, because the voices stop.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this is not. So that was Tim's mother-in-law. That Chris.
Is that like a Faraday cage?
I don't know. That's the kind of thing we'd get fired for, Andrew.
Now, whether it was symbolic, whether it's a symbolic thing or it really worked, I don't know. But she was in and out.
Look,
sorry.
If you think about it, if you're having this experience, right, and you are perceiving that something is invading you with these voices, then it makes sense to put a physical barrier. Right? I mean, they even did this in Total Recall. Like, remember when he had that thing implanted, right? He put the wet towel on his head. So they probably got that from the psych ward, you know.
They've done it from Born Identity as well, when he had that chip in his leg and he put that tin foil around it as well.
But it does remind me, though, of that. Who was the fellow who we had on here, Jerry, your friend, who was cured of the voices?
George,
that's right.
George. Yeah.
He always reminds me, I always think of him, because he said it felt like technology. And the further he got away from his house, the quieter the voices got. And then when he went back to his house, they got louder again. And he said it could. He didn't say it was technology. He said it possibly is something around that area of where he was. And
well, I'm sure that whatever technology was in his house was in other places too. Yeah. But you know, maybe he experienced trauma at his house. Maybe that's what brought it out, or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is this a similar phenomenon to like voice to skull type technology? I know it's not your fields or anything like that.
No. I think like this has been around a lot way longer. I mean, unless that technology has just been hidden from us and been there for centuries.
It could be like a copycat thing that the voice to skull could be, because you can't tell me that the powers that be don't know this phenomenon themselves. They might not be passing the information.
Well, there's a reason
someone knows about it. Someone knows about it, don't they? They must do.
Well, I think that may be real, but on the other hand, the voices also they tell the patient, listen, the government is putting these thoughts in your head, and if you look at it, that leaves the patient helpless to fight back. Yes. That's exactly what the voices want. They don't want them trying to fight back. They want them, well, you're at our disposal. We can do whatever we want. We can say whatever we want, and you're helpless. That's exactly the position they want to put these people in.
And I've had, there's been a handful of people that got in touch with me because of, what I do, and that they were asking me for help. And they believed, right, that they were, controlled by some kind of government technology like you're talking about. And I also think that is real, because there are some, testimony from military contractors and such talking about it. There may be equipment like that in Antarctica, actually. But aside from that, these folks, when I talked to them, my impression is that they had the typical schizophrenia type of experience, and they just believed that the government was, doing that, maybe because they heard about the real phenomenon. But, I can't know for sure, of course. None of us can, but, we'll have to wait till more of that information is
I suppose what I'm trying to say was, with all the experiment, like say with MK Ultra and all the other stuff that we're doing, and Jerry's obviously in his work, it's not dissimilar from the experiments like the staring at goats, the remote viewing, and all these other things that we're trying. They must know about this stuff. They must do, the intelligence agencies. Maybe this is the real source of life itself. Who knows?
Well, you think. A lot of these guys who are claiming that this voice to skull stuff is attacking them, you think it's some technology like that, they wouldn't use it on the average Joe.
Jerry, I heard about one deployment of this, from a military contractor, and they basically set it up at a homeless shelter. And what they did is that they recruited people from other cities, like people that were single and alone, that they were able to identify, and they basically offered them a job to move to this city, but then there was no actual job, so they were hoping these people were somewhat destitute, so they ended up in the shelter, and then they became targets of this technology. But it needed proximity, so they had like some kind of broadcasting device with this signal in the building. And when they were there is when they were getting that, signal to their brain directly, where they could receive.
And by the way, Jerry, I'm not trying to say that they're the same thing. I'm trying to say that it might be something that they're trying to copy, the technology they're trying to copy, as opposed to it being the same.
What worried me for a long time was, I put out the exact content of what schizophrenics hear, what the voices say, and what worried me was that if they got hold of that, they could mimic schizophrenia, so nobody could tell the difference.
Yeah,
that's true.
And I had to kind of weigh it. It's like, how much damage would that do, as opposed to letting the world know what these things are actually telling these people.
It would be a really good way to discredit someone, wouldn't it, Jerry?
Yeah, it would. And if psychiatrists or psychologists knew what these things were saying, I mean, the schizophrenic would be able to relate to them right away, instead of thinking of them as a enemy who's going to drug them silly. That's what happened to me. Once they found out that I knew what these voices were, they opened up and they would tell me more. And it was like incremental. It was year after year after year after year of finding out the details of what these things were telling them. And, I'd start off lots of times with going, well, okay, I know this is what they say. I know this is what they do. And the more information I had about them, the more the person would realize, hey, he knows what these things are, and he would listen, and they would be willing to fight back against them. It would be a way of saying, listen, they're not you. This is what they say. This is what they say to everybody. Yeah. I tried to run some groups with schizophrenics once. It didn't work real well. It was a failure. They were too paranoid of one another.
Also, I know the drug companies are huge, and I know they're obviously, we'd call it corrupt, but in their world, it's not corrupt. It's about making money. However, higher up the food chain than the money side of it, there has to be another aspect of keeping these people quiet. So maybe that's why they're sort of shoveling them into these psychiatric wards and drugging them out, because they don't want this information out there, because possibly.
Well, I think what Andrew said, they just want to keep them under control. Mm-hmm. When these phenothiazines were first discovered in a German dye lab, they were dyeing clothes and stuff. It was picked up by the French pharmaceutical agency. They wanted to test it on psychiatric patients in Europe, and the Freudians wouldn't allow it. So they brought it over to the United States, and they started with one state hospital, and it worked wonderful. All these guys were sedated. They were happy as clams. They didn't have to fight them, because, I got in the 70s, I was coming in just right after all they had were straitjackets, back in the 50s and early 60s. And they would have to battle these guys into the straitjackets. And people were getting hurt. Patients were getting hurt. The attendants were getting hurt. When they got these psychiatric drugs, psychiatry just latched onto them. There was a war between neurology and psychology, or psychiatry, and psychiatry was losing. When they got hold of these drugs, it was like, boy, they took off. They could now sedate entire populations. They didn't have to have as many attendants. They didn't have to have as many staff. People weren't getting hurt. They just drugged everybody up. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Imagine on like the story Andrew told, and from the passage out of the Bible that you requested. Imagine if that just became common knowledge, because that changes everything, doesn't it? Because that means there is something else. There is a bigger question to be asked than any of it. If everyone knew that as common knowledge, if that were on tonight's news, can you imagine the effects it'd have on the populace?
Well, they'd be a step closer to reality. The way they're going now, they're not curing anybody. You ask psychiatrists, how many people have you cured? 0. They're just treating symptoms. Matter of fact, you look at the report card here. In the United States, the CDC reports 132 people in the United States are killing themselves every day. Where do those thoughts come from? Did they generate them? Are they self-destructive? Where did that come from? Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in the United States. In 2021, 48,000 Americans killed themselves, and the rate increasing every year. Now it's close to 50,000.
We told a story about this in 2020, Jerry. Our father passed away, totally unrelated, but there's a bridge near my house. I live right on the moorland, the Pennines it's called. There's a bridge called Scammerton Bridge, and it's a massive single-span bridge. Well, it's big for our country anyway. And that's like a place where people who want to commit suicide hone in, and they jump over the bridge onto the motorway. Yeah, freeway where you guys are from. And in 2020, they were building a massive fence on the bridge. We came across it, didn't we, Chris? We went across the bridge, and the guys building it, they're putting like fences sloping inwards to stop people. That's how bad it had got, to stop people jumping off.
Yeah,
this was around the time that they were locking everybody down. So they knew they were making a change prior, because it stopped the whole motorway for a full day when somebody was on the bridge. And it was happening. It seemed to, because I only live about 2 or 3 miles away from that, but you could see the motorway from our house over the hillside, and it was stopping the motorway for a full day. So imagine everything's ground to a halt both ways, and people were jumping off and killing themselves as well.
So you look at, people are born with the mandate to survive. It's programmed into them. Look at what people do to survive. And then you look at 50,000 people a year in the U.S. killing themselves. Where do those thoughts come from?
That's the Vietnam War. 50,000 people a year.
Yes, that's the Vietnam War. Every year, year after year after year after year. The situation isn't getting any better. It's getting worse every year. The number of psychotic people and mentally ill people are increasing. But yet they won't look at, where do those thoughts come from? They fly in the face of the prime directive of the human being to survive.
Well, if you had a depopulation plan, that 50,000 figure there would be part of that plan somewhere. I'm sure.
I don't think it's a big enough number to really make a dent in that plan, although, it definitely does follow logically. There's some really interesting things about suicide, because we can see that it could be influenced culturally, like if we look at Japan, for example, where it's, it has traditionally been seen as a respectable way to, save face from a major blunder or failure. And then with the experiment, or what you talked about with the fence, that's been done, and it's actually very effective. So like in San Francisco, you probably heard of the Golden Gate Bridge. It's very famous. So that was a place where, a number of people every year jumped off to their death. And they just put, similarly, a fence to make it really, really difficult to jump off, and also a little placard with a, suicide hotline phone number.
That has as well.
But what happened is that for the whole city of San Francisco, like let's say there were 50 deaths a year from jumping off the bridge, after they did that, there were 50 less suicides in the city. So it wasn't like those people went there to jump off, saw that they couldn't, and then went somewhere else to kill themselves. It's like, because that one act was interrupted, they then no longer carried out a suicide. And it's very, very interesting. And the reason, I think, or the factor that allows that to happen, is that suicide typically is a very impulsive decision. that it happens in, now maybe they're thinking about it, so they went to the bridge, but they're sort of didn't really decide what they're going to do, and then have a moment where they're vulnerable and do it, and then, you can't take that back. So just delaying it, often that moment is passed, and then they may not ever have that moment again, or they may have, maybe it's because they got that close that they said, like Jerry pointed out, this is too far outside of my instincts of what they tell me to do to survive, so I'm going to figure out another way.
I've seen the same thing on the units that I worked on. They put them on suicide watch and let them sit there for a while until they kind of reconstitute a little bit, and then let them out.
But let's finish on some good points. There is hope, isn't there?
There is hope.
Yeah. Look, for the
uh,
first time ever that I've known, there's a clear path to recover from schizophrenia, right? Because of Jerry's work and Sherry's work and John Mace's work. So that's incredible.
Sherry's a force of nature.
Yeah, and John Mace is he invented a energetic psychotherapy that I've never seen anything work as well as it does. It gets rid of trauma, neutralizes trauma, and although it doesn't fully cure schizophrenics, I think, like I said, we only have 15-20% cure rate, but that's better than psychiatry. But it does get rid of the trauma.
Psychiatry has a 0%. I mean, if you follow people for 20 years, something like a third of them recover spontaneously in that time frame.
Yeah.
But that's when they're left alone, not when they're given psychiatric drugs.
Right. And Mace will get rid of the trauma that these entities feed off of. So even though in a lot of cases it won't cure them, that these entities don't have the food that they could trigger to turn into negative energy. Right? So if the person went through a trauma, the voices will come and go, hey, yeah, look what you did. That was awful. That was terrible. You're rotten. You're no good. You get rid of that. They can't do that anymore. It's gone.
So maybe the next time we meet up, maybe we should talk about Mace in more detail for people. And
we can do that.
Get hold of you. Is that what you're doing now, then, Andrew, as well in your practice?
Well, I only heard about the Mace Energy method a few months ago when I ran into Jerry in Arizona, and I've been investigating it since then. And it's not something I'm not really focusing on being a one-to-one practitioner these days. I'm teaching people, and there are already a number of good certified Mace therapists out there. Including Jerry, of course, but so I would probably be referring people or recommending that they look into the Mace Energy method and incorporating that in an overall kind of approach that I teach.
Right. So what is it? What exactly do you teach for people who might be interested? Or
well, it's funny you mentioned that because I'm actually going to be having a workshop on this very topic called the Strength of Spirit workshop in early March, and it's a combination of things. So, one is I teach about how the mind and the body interact with health, and that you can't separate them, and how you can support both while you're going through healing. I teach, methods like contemplation, which includes meditation, which helps you access a lot of your personal history, like to remember, some of the experiences that you may have had. And, obviously Mace method kind of bypasses that, but the typical insight work that many people still choose and can also be very successful for a lot of these things requires you to generate insight. And then I teach a lot about shadow psychology and how to transmute the shadow into into light or integration, which helps people overcome patterns of addiction, patterns of behavioral triggers like anger or losing their temper, things like that. I talk about how to repair interpersonal conflict, even without the other person participating. I talk about the role of nutrition in mental health. So it's a really kind of integrated, holistic approach. That because this is a very intimidating area to many people, to think about, you've got to figure out what your problems are and have a path to heal and solve those problems without a magic pill or, someone the whole time away saying, come on, you can do it, necessarily, right? That it's an independent exploration, and by nature, it requires going through some uncomfortable emotions. So it's important to, understand how to put all those things in context, how to maintain your gratitude to help you stay motivated, resources available that allow a different or easier approach depending on, your own preferences and personal style and beliefs. So that's the way I do it, looking at it from every angle.
So I suppose the 2020 debacle, it's given a lot of people a positive, how can I say, breakout from the conventional things they were doing prior to 2020. Is that what's happened to you? You've left conventional medicine and now you've found your way in control of your own life, I suppose.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, I was on that path already, trying to actually work with people in the system doing some of these things. I was in the system doing Jerry's approach, and, I'm glad that no other psychiatrists found out about it.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have liked it, I'm sure.
Guarantee you that.
But when I got, forced out of that system because of speaking out and refusing to, go along with COVID dictates, I was given full freedom, to explore what really works. And, I work with people and I teach about every kind of health condition. So I'm not limited to depression and anxiety and schizophrenia. It's been amazing because I've learned that everything that the health system says is a chronic, lifelong, incurable condition, that people can completely heal from it, turn it around 100% like they never had that experience to begin with, without one single prescription or surgical procedure. So it's extremely rewarding, and I wish I had learned these things sooner.
And it's the same thing with Mace. It's a energetic psychotherapy. There's no drugs involved, right? It gets rid of trauma within an hour. The worst thing that happened to you can be just dissolved. It takes care of most psychological problems because most of them result from trauma.
I think people become those trauma ideals, don't they?
They do. It affects
attachments.
them.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people that I've worked with that are 70 years old that something happened to them when they were 6 or 7, and they got the idea. The most common one is you're worthless or you're stupid, or and they carry that with them all their lives. In an hour, it's gone. So it's Mace is an energetic psychotherapy because you're an energetic person. Your spirit is energy. Your feelings are energy. Your thoughts are energy. Everything about you is energy. And what psychiatry does is drug your brain. Nobody's getting cured from drugging your brain. I
mean, in theory, the system tries to wear you down, doesn't it? That's what it does.
Yeah.
Everything in the system is wearing you down. So have you got anything else to ask, Chris?
No. Great chatting to you guys.
It's been brilliant. Obviously, I'm always pleased to meet Jerry, but it's been nice to meet you as well, Andrew.
One thing I would like to add, Dom. One thing I would like to add is
something.
No, sorry, because you can't help thinking, all the training you guys must have gone through to get. You just feel
brainwashing.
Yeah, but the thing is, Jerry, people go into nursing or doctors or psychiatry. They go into it for the right reasons because they want to help people, and then you suddenly get into the middle of it. You're trained up. You've spent years, and then you realise this isn't. It must be horrible to.
Well, psychiatry's got a very high suicide rate. they've got one of the highest suicide rate of
really?
any doctors.
Yeah. And the highest addiction rate as well.
Right, right.
But I think that might be more because it attracts the crazies, Jerry, rather than it drives you crazy.
Yeah, that might be true.
Or it could be the realization that you have done all that training, and what like especially through 2020, what you've done is all a facade, and you've got to lie to keep your job, and I mean that must drive people crazy. It's enough to drive anyone.
That's probably a part of it, because they taught me all these psychotherapies, and when I got onto the front lines with real mental patients, it was like trying to move a rhino off the road with a BB rifle. They just didn't work.
I've heard stories like with the people joining the police or the special forces in the military or even lawyers think they're getting involved in something. I won't include politicians, but maybe lawyers think they're getting involved in something to do good. Yeah. And then they end up getting poisoned by the very system that they're trying to help.
And all those jobs you mentioned, Dom, they're all the jobs that they can just change at any moment.
Oh, yeah.
It can just be a new government thing brought in and it changes.
One of the experiences I had in psychiatry was I worked a lot in the Veterans Administration system. And I'll tell you, there were many soldiers that I worked with that had that exact experience you're describing, where, they thought they were doing something patriotic and good, protecting our freedom. But then once they were over there in the theater of war and, they saw what was really going on, they were just consumed with guilt. Right. And it created such dissonance, right, that they couldn't even kind of just face it. And they went on a downhill path. I saw that many times.
The Mace would work great for veterans, would work absolutely great, but they don't want any part of it. We tried to break into a couple of veterans hospitals. They just blew it off.
But yeah, Jerry, we should talk about that, because I think it would be the way to go would be to go to the advocacy groups for the veterans, not the VA system, because they're government bureaucracy. But if you went to the DAV or places like that, they may be open-minded.
Okay.
Because it could say, oh, you could still go to the VA and take your drugs and then just try this on the side and see if it helps, and then they'll have amazing results and they'll never go back to the VA.
What would be the advocacy groups?
Like, first of all, you could actually call up the local VA and they'll have an office where they liaison with these groups, so they could tell you like which ones are active in your area. But the biggest one is the DAV, Disabled American Veterans. Like they help the veterans pursue, disability claims and provide transportation to appointments, all kinds of stuff.
Okay.
Probably help them, connect with AA meetings or support groups and all kinds of things. So that's where you could potentially fit in.
I remember I've got quite a few diaries from World War One, and they're interesting reads because you see a day-to-day picture of what these people were going through. But a lot of them that were injured obviously came back, and they were the first, I call them inmates, for want of a better word, of Tavistock. And a lot of the doctors at Tavistock, we've all heard about Tavistock, were experimented on using the very same treatments to get rid of shell shock, as they called it back then. But a lot of it was what they call post-traumatic stress disorder now. But they also went on to work for the early mind control in the UK agencies, if you like.
You were asking about targeted individuals. Is that like trying to recreate schizophrenia? If any place is working on that, it would be Tavistock.
Yes, yeah. But it seems that the returning military are used from an experimental purpose and have been done certainly since World War One, over and over again. Because all of them come back, obviously, with mental damage. It's just bound to do, aren't they? It's just
they use experimental weapons, experimental vaccines, all kinds of stuff, and it's been going on, for quite a long time. Right? I mean, we can even look at the Spanish flu contagion studies, right? Those were done on active military.
Yeah.
And prisoners.
we spoke about the the so-called Spanish flu. in a podcast. We did about a couple of hours on it. And one of the things that I used to ask going back 10 years for people when Spanish flu really became a popular subject around about 2009 with the swine flu nonsense as well. And I used to ask people, did they teach you Spanish flu at school? That was my question, wasn't it, Chris? I used to ask them. And nobody could say yes. And I said, so if hundreds of thousands or millions of people died from it, why didn't the teachers it at school? Surely that would be one of the things. Because it didn't happen the way they're telling us it happened. That's why they didn't teach us. That's my view.
That is quite interesting because, we definitely learned about other mass casualty events. They taught us about the bubonic plague, right? Yeah. But you're right. I don't recall specifically learning about it. No. But, that could be because
history was the only subject I liked, and they never talked to me. And World War II and World War I was two of the subjects. They never talked about that.
We started asking everyone about Spanish flu. No one did learn about it at school. Yeah. And also, like Dom says, there's no statues, there's no artwork. Between 50 to 100 million people died. But then it became very prevalent about 2018 as well. They started talking about it a lot more just in time for 2020. And I looked on Amazon, for instance, and there was barely no book. The books about the Spanish flu basically started in 2009. There was none really previous to that discussing Spanish flu.
Wow.
Yeah. And that is the interesting, which backs up when you talk about germ theory versus terrain theory, that really backs that up, because the history books, if you think about it, over here we have holidays like where people wear a poppy on November the 11th. But if more people died during the Spanish flu, surely there'd be some other, they love emblems, don't they, or something to make you feel bad about.
No, it totally makes sense. And I never really thought to look at it from that perspective, because I only looked for like medical papers from that time and scientific publications. And I don't know, like I didn't pay attention to what they said about the overall situation. I was more looking at what the experiments they were doing. So it is really fascinating. You'd think there would be a lot more about it. I wonder what we'll see in 50 years about, the COVID situation. What would be the historical record? I've been curious about that for a while.
Yeah, we have.
They'll try to bury it.
Well, yeah. One of the other things as well is normally in like our village, there's a monument, normally a obelisk or something like that, for World War I.
Like a memorial to all the people who died.
Yeah. There's nothing for Spanish flu, nothing. And you would have thought in a modern day there would have been erecting things like that and saying this village had 50 people that disappeared from Spanish flu, not just people dying on the trenches type of thing.
Plus, I heard, anecdotal stories from that time that there were so many deaths that there were no burial sites at the cemeteries and people had to bury bodies in the backyard. So we would have to have massive, graves from that era that
don't exist.
Should be.
They don't exist. And also, after at the end of World War II, there were massive celebrations, weren't there? Obviously, World War I. Sorry, there was massive celebrations, and there was. But I think it was the Kentucky horse race was still running. They published these pictures of people wearing masks, but yet these were horse races or football matches over here, or cricket games or baseball games. You've got videos of people, and just tens of thousands of people in these crowds. If there was a problem at the so-called pandemic.
But they were wearing masks?
No, they weren't. No, that's what I mean. But they show you these set-up pictures of people in ambulances wearing masks, so-called.
They look pretty superimposed, and don't they?
In comparison to the pictures, they're super white. Yeah.
Very dodgy.
Well, that's very interesting. I think you should do an in-depth thing and write a book on this, because
I'm just finishing my first book actually. But it is something that. I think anyway. We'll stop there, because I think it'd be a good one to pick up on the terrain versus germ theory. If you're willing to come along again, Andrew.
I'm always game.
Yeah, you shouldn't say that to us, because we'll have you on every week. No, I'm joking. Yeah, but it's been great, Jerry. It's been great catching up, and Andrew. It's been great meeting you. I don't want to take any more. It's been an hour and a half. It seems to have gone in a breath.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm sure everybody listening will enjoy it. They always enjoy these conversations. It's difficult to get into your head that these things could be esoteric in nature, isn't it? Because we're always been brought up on the conventional. I noticed a comment on one of the podcasts we did there, Jerry, about 6 months ago, and it said something like, remember, there's no proof that these things are real, right? But sometimes you're not going to find
proof
solid...
that they're not either.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
But sometimes you're not going to find solid proof either way. You've got to go with the information there in front of you, a bit like the Spanish flu. The information is that there were hardly any books written, and we weren't taught it at school. That's real.
Why I put out that list of patterns, because anybody working with schizophrenics, any psychiatrist, any counselor, anybody working with them, well, those patterns are right there. They're right in front of them. All they got to do is open their eyes and look.
The strange thing is, they won't say someone's diagnosed someone with schizophrenia, they will have set patterns, let's say, that diagnose them with schizophrenia, but yet they won't use your patterns the opposite way around.
No. And if they're running patterns, then they can't be hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run fixed patterns among hundreds of people.
Yeah. I have a few hallucinations sometimes.
Something wrong with that.
I have a few hallucinations sometimes. I've had to talk to Chris.
I think the most important thing is not that we can definitively know exactly what's going on, right? I mean, because even the more information we hear, the more questions we generate. But the key is, can people actually recover and lead a better life? And if that's the case, that's the most important thing. And let's keep asking the questions, and hopefully we'll learn more and more over time.
Yeah. And that's it. We'll leave it there.
They're not asking the questions.
Starts with an inquisitive mind.
I'm saying we keep asking the questions.
We keep asking them.
Others, right?
All right.
You must be over some target, because otherwise they wouldn't be wanting to get rid of people like yourselves out of the system.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thanks everybody for tuning in. This is part 1 of episode 267, I do believe.
268.
Are you sure, Chris?
Yep.
268. Yeah, right. You lose track recording that much. I'd like to thank Jerry and Andrew for joining us today. We'll see you next week. Bye.
See you later. Bye.
I will grow old, then I will die. I'll be